The lounge was the kind of place designed to make people like her feel invisible. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch as she stepped through its glass doors, her pace steady, heels clicking softly on the polished floor. She moved with the kind of grace that didn't ask permission, her beige trench coat flowing behind her, one hand resting just above her pregnant belly. 6 months along, but not a single sign of fatigue in her posture. She looked around once, calmly, before stepping to the reception desk. The young white receptionist glanced up with the practiced smile of someone who had already decided something before a word had been spoken. Her gaze lingered just a second too long, on Jasmine's skin, her natural afro, the small Louis Vuitton carry-on by her side, before flicking back to her screen. "Ma'am, this area is for first-class and elite passengers only," she said, voice thin but sharp. Jasmine didn't blink. She reached into her purse and placed her platinum boarding pass and federal ID on the desk, her hand steady, her tone quieter than the woman deserved. "I know," she said. "That's me." There was a pause, a silence that wasn't confusion, it was disbelief. The receptionist looked again, slower this time, her mouth tightening just slightly as if trying to understand how this moment was happening. She tapped her tablet, more for show than necessity. Jasmine could see it in her eyes. The documents didn't matter, not really. A man emerged from the hallway behind the desk, dressed in a navy blazer and a look of impatient authority. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, scanning Jasmine like she was a malfunction in the system. "She says she's first class," the receptionist murmured. "I am," Jasmine said calmly. He looked her up and down, and in that split second, every inch of her was judged, her hair, her belly, her skin. Then came the smile. It wasn't friendly. "Ma'am, you'll need to step aside. Security will verify your boarding pass at the main terminal," he said, already turning to wave someone over. Jasmine opened her mouth, then closed it again. There was no point. 2 security guards approached. The younger one looked confused. The older one didn't look at her at all. They escorted her out. Phones were already out. A few passengers nearby tilted their heads, watching like they'd seen this scene before. A white woman near the coffee bar whispered to her friend, "Why do they even try? Like, obviously." Jasmine didn't stop walking, didn't ask for an explanation. She just moved through the hush like a ghost people were trying not to acknowledge. Her back stayed straight. Her hand never left her belly. She reached gate 17 and lowered herself slowly onto the hard bench. The room buzzed with conversations that didn't involve her, didn't care about her, but she didn't cry. She just reached for her phone, dialed a number, and spoke softly into the receiver. "I'm at gate 17. I'm okay, but I need you now." The phone call ended with silence on the other end. No questions, no panic, just the quiet acknowledgement of a man who had learned long ago that when Jasmine used that tone, something wasn't right. She slipped the phone back into her bag and folded her hands in her lap. Across from her, a toddler stared at her with wide eyes until his mother pulled him closer, casting a sideways glance that said more than words ever could. Jasmine didn't respond. She had learned, through years of trial and restraint, that silence could be more powerful than protest. Her fingers brushed the edge of her boarding pass still tucked neatly into her coat pocket, but she didn't reach for it. It was never about the paper, it was about the perception. 15 years of courtrooms, 23 countries, countless panels and keynote addresses on civil rights, global justice, and anti-discrimination policy. But none of that mattered. Here, she was just a black woman sitting alone, her credentials invisible under her skin. Her mind flickered back to the award she received in Geneva 2 nights ago. An engraved plaque now wrapped carefully in her luggage that sat under the plane she had paid full price to fly on. And yet, somehow, the people in this airport felt entitled to treat her like a trespasser. Not because of her actions, not because of her words, but because of what they thought they saw when they looked at her. She reached down and rubbed a small circle across the top of her belly. "We're okay," she whispered. "Just another storm to walk through." Her voice was so low, no one heard it, but she wasn't speaking for anyone else. She was reminding herself. A quiet strength lived in her bones, one she'd spent a lifetime building. It wasn't shaken by airports. It wasn't broken by stairs. The sound of a mop bucket rolling nearby pulled her gaze to the janitor. He was a black man, maybe in his 40s, moving slowly down the terminal walkway with earbuds in and a caution sign clipped to his cart. For a brief second, he locked eyes with her. Not pity, not surprise, just understanding. He held her gaze longer than most people dared, then gave her the faintest nod before disappearing around the corner. Jasmine exhaled slowly and leaned back into the bench. She didn't need to check her phone. She knew Malcolm was already moving. Somewhere, high above the city, the sky shifted as the engines of a private jet changed direction mid-air. Inside the cabin, Malcolm Reed sat still, his posture relaxed but his expression unreadable. He hadn't spoken since the call. He didn't need to. His pilot had seen the name on the incoming screen, Jasmine, and knew immediately to reroute without instruction. The plane sliced through the clouds, banking slightly toward the city airport where everything had just gone wrong. Malcolm didn't look out the window. He didn't pace. He didn't call ahead. He simply sat, one hand resting on the tablet. In his lap, the other slowly tightening into a fist on the armrest. Back at Gate 17, Jasmine remained seated, her legs crossed delicately at the ankle, her trench coat folded neatly over her lap. The noise of the terminal rose and fell around her. Boarding calls, luggage wheels, the clatter of announcements, none of which included her name. She didn't need them to. She wasn't waiting for a flight anymore. She was waiting for a shift. The same supervisor who had escorted her out earlier now stood near the gate agent's desk, laughing casually with a colleague, unaware that every second was being watched by someone approaching the building faster than any of them could imagine. Across the room, a teenage girl took a photo of Jasmine with her phone, pretending to check her messages. Jasmine noticed, but didn't move. She had long since grown used to the strange choreography of quiet surveillance, the way people stared but pretended not to, the way they held judgment in one hand and justification in the other. Then something changed. The automatic doors at the far end of the terminal slid open, and the rhythm of the space shifted by an invisible degree. Jasmine didn't look up. She didn't need to. She felt it in her chest first. A low current moving through the air like something heavy but silent had just entered the room. The people around her continued scrolling, sipping, walking. But one by one they began to notice. Heads turned. Voices lowered, and the supervisor, mid-sentence, stopped smiling. Malcolm Reed had arrived. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Malcolm Reed walked through the terminal like gravity had shifted around him, drawing attention without demanding it. The tailored Navy flight jacket clung to his frame, his posture military straight, his pace unhurried. He carried nothing in his hands, no briefcase, no phone, just presence. The floor seemed to quiet beneath each step. The staff, near the gate, desk glanced toward him, instinctively straightening, though they still hadn't connected him to the woman they'd dismissed just minutes earlier. Jasmine looked up slowly, her eyes meeting his as he approached. No relief on her face, just quiet confirmation. She didn't rise. She didn't need to. He stopped 2 steps in front of her, eyes scanning her body like he was making sure she was still whole, still breathing steady. When he saw that she was, he gave the smallest nod and extended his hand. She took it, rising not as a victim being rescued, but as someone simply standing beside the right witness. The supervisor recognized him a second too late. "Mr. Reed?" The voice cracked on the first syllable, like surprise collided with fear, mid-air. We weren't informed you'd be arriving today." Malcolm didn't answer. He turned his body slightly, angling himself just enough for the badge on his flight jacket to become visible. Sky First Aviation. Founder, CEO, Commander. The silence that followed didn't need translation. The receptionist who'd first questioned Jasmine had gone pale. Her lips parted, but no sound forming. Someone dropped a clipboard behind the counter, and no one moved to pick it up. "She was told to leave," Malcolm said finally, voice low and measured, aimed not just at the staff, but the air itself. "Escorted, dismissed, laughed at." He let the words settle like weight. "And no one asked her name." The manager opened his mouth, but Malcolm raised a hand, not to silence him, but to make it clear that the moment to speak had passed. His gaze moved slowly across the room, eyes meeting every face that had witnessed, every face that had turned away. Then, without a hint of drama, he looked at Jasmine and said, "Let's go." And just like that, the atmosphere split. People parted as they walked side by side through the terminal, one woman calm, the other man unreadable, and behind them, silence lingered like a verdict. They could have kept walking. Jasmine was ready to. But halfway down the terminal corridor, Malcolm stopped. Not abruptly, not theatrically, just enough to turn, enough to let his silence say what words could never. Jasmine paused beside him, her expression unreadable, but her hand subtly shifted to rest atop his. She knew this moment wasn't about anger. It was about reckoning. Malcolm looked back toward the lounge, his eyes narrowing slightly as he scanned the staff who were now frozen in place. The manager had moved toward the desk, pretending to check something on the computer, but his fingers trembled against the screen. The receptionist clutched her clipboard like it might shield her from what was coming. "I built this terminal," Malcolm said calmly, his voice carrying farther than its volume should have allowed. "Every gate, every square foot of this lounge. My company financed it. My pilots fly out of it. My team staffs it. And the woman you dismissed, without question, without verification, is not just my wife. She's the reason I built this company." "In the first place." A hush rolled through the terminal like a wave pulling breath from the room. Cameras began to rise, not from official press but from passengers who now understood that whatever this was, it wasn't ordinary. The manager stepped forward, forcing a smile, his tone suddenly fragile. "Mr. Reed, I'm sure there's a misunderstanding. If we'd known." Malcolm turned his head slowly, cutting him off with a look sharper than any command. "That's exactly the problem," he said. "You didn't know, and you didn't care to." Jasmine's hand tightened just slightly around his. Her face was calm, but there was something unmistakable in her posture now. Dignity, anchored, and complete. Not because she was defended, but because someone had finally said aloud what she'd carried silently for years. A young black janitor who'd been watching from a distance stood still, mop in hand, eyes locked on Malcolm. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Something in his stance said he understood, maybe more than anyone else in the room. Malcolm took one final look at the group before him, then turned back toward Jasmine. "Come on," he said, quieter, "this time." And this time, when they walked away, no one dared to look away. They didn't make it to the car. Before they reached the exit, Malcolm's phone buzzed in his pocket, his assistant on the other end, breathless. "There's already footage online," she said. "You confronting the staff. People are tagging the airline. It's spreading. Fast." Malcolm didn't respond. He simply glanced toward the glass-walled Sky First Executive Lounge upstairs and turned. Jasmine followed without a word. Within minutes, he was standing behind the podium inside the private suite he had designed himself. It was meant for corporate press announcements and VIP guest events, not impromptu reckonings, but the irony wasn't lost on anyone. Behind him, the Sky First logo glowed softly against a marble wall. In front of him, the same staff who had ignored, mishandled, and silenced his wife now stood motionless, flanked by cameras and passengers who had followed out of curiosity, their phones recording everything. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't point fingers. He told the truth. "This morning," he said, "my wife, a civil rights attorney, a mother, a first-class passenger, was denied access to this lounge. No one asked her name. No one looked at her boarding pass. They saw her skin, her silence, her strength, and assumed she didn't belong." His eyes swept across the room, stopping on the manager. "That's not just bad service. That's bias, baked into protocol." The supervisor shifted uncomfortably, his jaw clenched, but Malcolm didn't give him the space to speak. "I've spent my life building this company to stand for something better," Malcolm continued, "and that starts today, with accountability." Then, without missing a beat, he turned to a face in the crowd. The janitor, Elijah, stood at the back, stunned. "You," Malcolm said, his tone softening but not losing focus. "You witnessed what happened, and you had the courage to hold her gaze when no one else would. Come forward." Elijah hesitated. The crowd parted as he stepped into view, mop still in hand. Malcolm looked directly at him. "As of this moment," he said, "you're no longer on sanitation. You're being promoted to floor supervisor. Full benefits, full authority. Report to corporate HR by noon tomorrow." Elijah's lips parted, but no words came. Jasmine watched from the side, expression unchanged, but her eyes shimmered ever so slightly in the soft lighting. Not from shock. From something older, something earned. Malcolm turned back to the group. "Everyone else will report for mandatory training this week. And as for the staff responsible for today's incident, your clearance is suspended until further notice. I'll be reviewing every name personally." No one moved, no one spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was final. Then Malcolm walked. Away. Not out of anger, but completion. And beside him, Jasmine walked too. Her steps light, her shoulders square, her presence no longer ignored, but now impossible to forget. The drive home was quiet. Not heavy, not strained, just filled with the kind of silence that didn't need to be interrupted. Jasmine rested her head against the window, watching the city drift past in streaks of light and shadow. Malcolm sat beside her, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on her knee. His grip was gentle, but steady, like he was still anchoring her to the ground even after the storm had passed. Neither of them had said much since leaving the airport. They didn't have to. Everything had already been said in front of the people who needed to hear it. Back at the penthouse, the world felt slower. The curtains let in the soft burn of the late afternoon sun, casting golden light across the marble floors and muted walls. Jasmine moved to the kitchen, filled a glass with cold water, and stood there for a long moment before taking a sip. Malcolm watched her from the doorway, his tie now loosened, sleeves rolled. He looked like a man still carrying the weight of restraint. "You didn't have to do all that," she said finally, her voice quiet but even. "You could have just taken me home." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked over, leaned against the counter beside her, and met her eyes. "I didn't do it for you," he said. "You already know who you are, but they didn't, and now they can't forget." She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's never just about them forgetting," she murmured. "It's about how many more like them are still out there." He nodded, then reached for her hand and gently placed it over her belly. "That's why we fight," he said. "So our daughter won't have to say please just to be seen." Jasmine blinked slowly, the warmth in her chest wrapping itself around the ache she hadn't let show. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and for a moment neither of them moved. The city pulsed outside, the streets still busy, the world still turning. But in this moment, nothing felt rushed. Eventually, Malcolm pulled away, walking toward the living room where the news played quietly in the background. Footage from the airport was already making headlines, the clip of him standing. Behind that podium had been looped 3 times in the last hour. The caption below read, "CEO confronts racism in his own terminal." Jasmine joined him on the couch, curling beside him with her feet tucked beneath her. She watched the screen, then turned away from it, her eyes distant. "You think this will change anything?" she asked. Malcolm looked at her. Not as a husband, not as a man with power, but as someone who had seen too much of the world to offer false hope. "It's a start," he said. "And sometimes a start is enough to crack something open." Jasmine exhaled, eyes drifting toward the skyline where the last edge of sunlight faded into the quiet gray of approaching evening. She didn't reply, but her silence wasn't empty. It was a pause before the next step. The next morning brought no calm. The footage had gone viral overnight. Every news outlet had a version of the story, some sanitized, some sensationalized. But the truth was undeniable. Jasmine Crockett, civil rights attorney and wife of aviation mogul Malcolm Reed, had been denied access to a terminal her husband's company helped build. And she hadn't raised her voice once. That detail seemed to captivate everyone. The way she'd endured it quietly, the way she hadn't needed to prove anything until someone else stepped forward. By noon, Jasmine's inbox was full. Requests for interviews, panels, statements. She ignored most of them, but one message caught her attention. A formal invitation to speak before the city's Transportation and Equity Board, following public outcry. It wasn't just a request. It was a moment waiting to be shaped. She sat with it for an hour before replying with a single line, "I'll be there." 2 days later, the meeting room was packed. The kind of packed where even standing space ran out long before the session began. City officials sat lined in front, faces stiff with anticipation. Reporters lined the back wall, pens twitching. A row of security stood by the exits, though no one was protesting. They weren't here to riot. They were here to listen. Jasmine entered through the side, wearing a dark navy dress that made her presence quiet but unmistakable. She didn't carry notes. She didn't need them. When her name was called, she stepped up to the podium, adjusted the microphone once, and looked out at the room. Not to intimidate, but to remind them she saw everything. "I'm not here to speak for myself," she began, voice calm but firm. "Because I was lucky. I had a name someone recognized. I had a husband with power. I had a platform to speak from. But most people who look like me, who've gone through what I did, don't get any of that. They get silence. They get shrugged off. They get escorted out without anyone asking why." She paused. Not for effect, but to let the truth breathe. My crime, in that moment, wasn't disorder. It wasn't deception. It was standing still in the wrong skin, with the wrong assumptions hanging in the air. Somewhere in the crowd, someone shifted uncomfortably. She heard it, noticed it, kept going. "I'm not interested in apologies," she said. "I'm not interested in headlines or ceremonies. What I want is policy, procedure, accountability. I want the kind of change that isn't printed on press releases but written into the bones of how we treat people. Because access shouldn't depend on assumptions, and dignity shouldn't need to be defended." The room was silent. Not because they didn't believe her, but because no one could refute what she'd just said. She stepped back from the mic. No dramatic ending. No prepared quote. Just a simple nod before returning to her seat. And for a long time after, no one dared to speak. The plaque was installed 3 weeks later, quietly without ceremony, but not without meaning. It stood near the entrance of Terminal C, right beneath the Skyfirst emblem etched in brushed steel. There were no flashing lights, no press conference, just a clean inscription surrounded by polished glass and soft uplighting. Passengers passed by it on their way to departure gates, some pausing, some reading aloud, some not at all. But it was there, immovable and real. To every traveler who was told they didn't belong, your journey matters. Your dignity is not up for discussion. Jasmine visited it for the first time on a Sunday morning, just after sunrise. The terminal was quiet, nearly empty. She stood in front of the plaque with her hands folded, her coat pulled close to her shoulders. The air was cold, but her body felt still, centered in a way she hadn't felt that day it all happened. She didn't touch the glass. She didn't need to. The words were already part of her now. Behind her, Elijah approached with a clipboard, in hand. His uniform was new, his posture different. He'd grown into the role quickly, not just because he'd been given the opportunity, but because he'd been seen. He paused beside her, his voice low. "They added that because of you," he said. Jasmine smiled faintly. "They added that because they had to." A few feet away, a young black girl stood with her mother, pointing toward the plaque. The little girl whispered something, and her mother leaned down to reply. Jasmine couldn't hear their words, but she saw the expression on the child's face, the mixture of curiosity and quiet awe. "She looks like a queen," the girl said. Jasmine didn't turn around. She just closed her eyes for a moment, letting the words settle like warmth on her skin. She wasn't looking for praise. She didn't want to be a symbol. But if her presence gave that girl the sense that she could walk into any space and be respected, then maybe something had shifted after all. She exhaled slowly, then turned away from the glass. The plaque would stay behind. the message wouldn't. She boarded the flight without hesitation. No guards, no sideways glances, no one asking her to prove who she was. The attendant at the gate greeted her by name this time, her voice steady, respectful, neutral in the way it should have been from the start. Jasmine nodded politely, scanned her boarding pass, and walked down the jet bridge alone. Inside the aircraft, she settled into the window seat of a quiet first-class cabin. The sun had barely risen above the skyline, casting pale gold streaks across the tarmac. Beyond the glass, the terminal she once walked through in silence now stood still, clean, quiet, changed. She leaned back, resting one hand over her stomach, the other tucked beneath the thin airline blanket. There was no need to replay the past. It had already echoed loud enough. The engines hummed to life beneath her. As the plane rolled back from the gate, her reflection in the window merged with the morning sky. She watched her own face in silhouette, the faint curve of her smile framed in the glass. Not pride, not revenge, just presence, undeniable, unshaken, unbothered. "They tried to humiliate me," she murmured to herself, eyes still on the clouds gathering at the horizon. "But all they did was remind me who I am." A few rows behind her, a woman whispered her name to a friend. She heard it but didn't react. The story was no longer about that moment in the terminal. It was about the doors it opened, about what would happen next, because this wasn't a victory speech, and she wasn't flying away from something. She was flying toward everything that still needed to change. The wheels lifted. The runway fell away beneath her, and somewhere in the rising quiet, Jasmine closed her eyes. Not to rest, but to carry it all forward. They mistook her silence for surrender. But what she carried wasn't weakness. It was the weight of 1,000 voices waiting to be heard. This story wasn't just about Jasmine Crockett. It was about anyone who's ever been overlooked, dismissed, or silenced before they even had a chance to speak. Have you ever been judged without a word, only to prove later that you were the one holding all the power? If you believe dignity should never depend on appearance, drop a like. If you've ever been told you don't belong, share this story with someone who needs to feel seen. And if you're still carrying your voice, still walking through rooms where people try to shrink your presence, stay with us. There's more to come.